Welcome, welcome, welcome. Pull up a chair. Or better yet, pull back the covers. Find that pillow that has somehow become perfectly shaped to the back of your skull and settle in. You have landed in exactly the right place on exactly the right evening. Tonight, we are going to spend some time together with one of the most famous images in American history. An image so deeply embedded in the culture that you have almost certainly seen it, probably many times, possibly on a tote bag in a museum gift shop, or on a coffee mug someone received as a birthday present, or on a motivational poster tacked to the wall of a classroom that smelled faintly of dry erase markers and yesterday's lunch. You know the one, a woman in a red and white polka dot bandana, her sleeve rolled up to reveal a flexed arm, her jaw set with quiet determination, and 4 words above her, "We can do it." You know Rosie the Riveter. Everyone knows Rosie the Riveter, and almost everything you know about her is wrong. Not a little wrong. Not technically wrong the way that most history gets slightly garbled over time, the way the details of family stories shift between grandparents and grandchildren until the original event has become something almost unrecognizable. Genuinely, fundamentally, almost entertainingly wrong. The name is wrong. The purpose is wrong. The timing is wrong. The image is wrong, in the sense that the image everyone associates with the name was not called by that name when it was made, and was not publicly visible until decades after the war it supposedly symbolizes. The woman in the image is wrong. Or rather, the story of who she is has been revised so many times that the truth itself became a kind of detective story with an ending that arrived only months before the probable real subject died. And the meaning everyone assigns to the image, that warm, certain, feminist reading of a woman declaring her own capability, that meaning is arguably backwards. Not entirely wrong, but constructed 40 years after the fact by people with very different needs than the people who originally made the image. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Tonight, we're going to take our time. We are going to start at the very beginning. Back before there was a poster, before there was a name, before there was a myth. We're going to walk through factories and feel the heat and hear the noise. We're going to meet the real women whose lives were turned sideways by the war. We're going to watch a propaganda machine spin a particular kind of story and watch what happens when that story is rediscovered by a different generation with different needs. And then we are going to sit with the gap between the symbol and the history, which turns out to be one of the more interesting gaps in 20th century American culture. If this kind of slow, careful, slightly subversive trip through history is the kind of thing you enjoy, we would love it if you took a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are hundreds of hours of material here, and every episode is made for exactly this moment. Quiet evenings, tired minds, the small luxury of learning something true while the rest of the world makes noise about other things. And before we begin, we would genuinely love to know where you are watching from tonight. Drop your city, your country, even just your time zone in the comments. There's something quietly wonderful about knowing that someone in Manchester and someone in a small city in Manitoba are all settling in for the same story at almost the same time. Go ahead and dim the lights. If you have not already done so, find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they have gathered up near your ears. Let your jaw go soft. The story will keep. It has been waiting since 1943, and it can wait another 30 seconds for you to get comfortable. Ready? Then let's begin. It is the spring of 1942, and America has been at war for roughly 4 months. The attack on Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, a date that entered the language almost immediately as a shorthand for shock and catastrophe, and the ending of one era and the violent beginning of another. Within days of the attack, the United States had declared war on Japan. Within days after that, Germany and Italy had declared war on the United States, and suddenly the largest industrial economy on earth was mobilizing for a conflict that would eventually involve more than 16 million American service members, most of them young men who had been, in some cases very recently, working in factories or on farms or sitting in classrooms. You are a factory manager in the spring of 1942, and you have a problem. Your problem is that the men who ran your machines last year are gone. They are in uniform. They are being trained in camps whose locations are not publicly disclosed. They are going to be shipped to places you can barely find on a map, places with names you are still learning to pronounce. And meanwhile, The government has just informed you that your factory, which previously made refrigerators or washing machines or automobile parts, now makes aircraft fuselage sections or shell casings or tank components, and it needs to produce them at a volume that would have seemed absolutely delusional 18 months ago. You need workers. You need them now, and for reasons that seem perfectly obvious to everyone in the spring of 1942. The most obvious solution did not immediately present itself. Women. It sounds almost comically simple in retrospect. Women made up roughly half the population. Many of them had no paid employment outside the home. Many more were employed in jobs that paid a fraction of what factory work would pay. They were physically capable of operating machinery. They were, in large numbers, available and in need of income. The war had created both a labor shortage and an enormous manufacturing demand. And women were the logical answer to both problems simultaneously. And yet, almost nobody wanted to hire them. This is the first thing that the Rosie myth gets wrong, and it gets it wrong in a particularly revealing way. The story we tell today implies that women were enthusiastically welcomed into the wartime workforce, that factories threw open their doors and the government cheered them in, and the whole country celebrated the practical wisdom of female labor. The image, with its confident flexed arm and its "We can do it" slogan, feels like a welcome mat unrolled at the factory entrance. It was not a welcome mat. It was a desperate plea. And even then, the people making the plea were not entirely sure they meant it as warmly as the image suggests. Factory managers, in the early months of the war, were deeply reluctant to hire women for heavy industrial work. The reasons were various, and they range from genuine logistical concern to the kind of assumptions that feel embarrassing to state plainly today. There were worries about physical strength, though most factory work did not actually require extraordinary physical strength in most stations. There were worries about women being unable to handle machinery, though women have been operating machines of various kinds for decades in textile mills and garment factories and food processing plants. There were worries about productivity, about absenteeism, about what would happen when a woman had a sick child and could not come in, a problem that somehow did not generate equal worry about what would happen when a man had a sick child and his wife stayed home. There were vague, unexamined discomforts about women in industrial environments that nobody quite wanted to articulate as prejudice, because if you articulated them as prejudice, you would then have to reckon with having prejudice, which is an uncomfortable reckoning. So they articulated them as policy. Many factories in 1941 and early 1942 had official policies against hiring women for production work, not against hiring women at all, since women were perfectly acceptable in clerical positions, in cafeteria work, in janitorial roles. But the actual production floor, the place where the real work was done and the real wages were paid, that was considered a different category of space, one that the cultural imagination had already assigned exclusively to men. You can imagine the internal conversations. Surely we can find male workers somewhere. Surely this shortage is temporary. Surely we do not need to fundamentally rethink our entire understanding of who belongs in a factory just because of this war. The war was patient. It would prove them wrong. But it took time, and in that time, thousands of women who could have been working were not, and thousands of quota targets that could have been met were not, and the gap between what the war required and what the factories were producing remained frustratingly wide. By the summer of 1942, the reality of the labor shortage was becoming impossible to continue ignoring. The military was absorbing men at a rate that the most pessimistic pre-war planners had not quite prepared for. The draft expanded steadily. Voluntary enlistment was enormous, driven by a combination of genuine patriotism and the social pressure of living in a country at war. Factory supervisors who had been certain that the shortage was temporary were now looking at rosters with gaps in them that were not getting smaller. And the factories that were now under government contract to produce the materials of war were finding themselves unable to meet their quotas, not because of equipment problems or material shortages, but simply because they did not have enough people to perform the work. You were standing on the factory floor in August of 1942, and the smell hit you before anything else. Oil and metal shavings and the acrid, almost sweet bite of welding smoke drifting from the far end of the building. The noise is a physical sensation, not just something you hear, but something you feel in your sternum, in your back teeth, in the bones of your forearms when they rest against a metal surface. Giant presses stamp metal, into curved shapes. Conveyor belts carry components from one station to the next with the indifferent patience of machines that do not know what day it is. Workers in coveralls and safety goggles move with the practiced efficiency of people who've been doing this long enough to stop consciously thinking about it. But there are gaps. Stations that should have workers are empty. The production line slows in places it should not slow. Supervisors move between stations with the slightly haunted look of people trying to operate a machine that is missing several essential components. People who can see exactly what is wrong and are running out of ways to fix it with the tools they have already tried. Production targets are being missed. And in the summer of 1942, missing production targets is not merely a business problem. It is a war problem. The soldiers who need the bombers and the shells and the tank treads do not have the luxury of waiting for the factory managers to become comfortable with a different kind of workforce. The pressure from Washington arrives with the bluntness of an official telegram. Production must increase. Quotas must be met. Find workers. And so, almost reluctantly, the factories began to hire women. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting and where the myth begins to diverge from the reality in ways that are both fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable. The government, recognizing that there was a public persuasion problem as much as a labor problem, began to mobilize its propaganda apparatus. And propaganda in wartime America was a serious, well-funded, professionally organized enterprise, not the clumsy and obvious thing the word sometimes suggests, but a sophisticated effort to shape how ordinary Americans understood what was happening and what was expected of them. The Office of War Information, established in the summer of 1942, coordinated a massive campaign to manage public understanding of the war, the home front, and the duties of citizenship in a time of national emergency. Magazine editors and radio broadcasters and advertising agencies were brought into this effort, not always by direct instruction, but by the shared assumption that the culture should pull in a single direction. Part of this effort involved persuading women to take factory jobs. Part of it involved persuading factory managers to actually hire them. These were related but distinct campaigns, and they required different kinds of messaging. For women, the appeal was almost entirely patriotic. Your country needs you. Your husband, your brother, your son is fighting somewhere beyond the horizon, and this is how you fight alongside him. Taking a factory job is an act of loyalty, of contribution, of sacrifice extended to a national scale. The woman who works in the factory is not just earning money. She is, in the logic of propaganda, participating in the war as surely as the man who carries a rifle. For factory managers, the message was considerably more practical. Women can do this work. Their smaller hands are well suited to the close assembly work that certain components require. They are patient and precise and unlikely to create labor trouble. They will be grateful for the wages. The investment in training them will pay off. That second message, crafted for the benefit of factory managers rather than the women themselves, was the origin of a particular strain of workplace mythology about women's capabilities that is worth pausing over. The argument was not that women were generally capable of anything they attempted. It was a narrower, more strategic claim that women were naturally suited to detailed, repetitive, precision-based work because of qualities attributed to their femininity, their domestic experience with needlework and cooking and fine motor tasks. The argument made them ideal for certain kinds of factory assembly. This is the kind of argument that looks like a compliment and functions as a cage. It welcomed women into certain specific industrial roles, while simultaneously suggesting that their fitness for those roles was not evidence of broader capability, but of a specifically feminine nature that would never quite reach the top rungs of the ladder. You can do this particular job because you are a woman, not you can do this job despite perceptions about women. The distinction mattered. It worked in the sense that it helped get women onto factory floors. What it did with them once they were there is another story. But before we go any further into the factories and the conditions within them, we need to talk about the song. The song came before the poster. The song came before almost everything people associate with the Rosie mythology, and yet the song is almost never mentioned when people discuss the image or the symbol. This is a significant oversight, because understanding the song helps you understand how the myth assembled itself. In the spring of 1942, two songwriters named Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb wrote a song called Rosie the Riveter. It was a cheerful, upbeat number in the style of the era, the kind of song that would not have sounded out of place in a radio variety program or a vaudeville show. The song was bright and patriotic and moved along at a pace that suggested confidence in the outcome of things. It celebrated a woman named Rosie who worked on the assembly line while her boyfriend Charlie served in the Marines. The Kay Kaiser Orchestra recorded a version of the song, and it reached #1 on the pop charts. People heard it on the radio during the summer of 1942. They hummed it at lunch counters. Factory workers heard it and recognized something in it, or at least something meant to be recognizable. And the name Rosie the Riveter became a kind of shorthand in the popular culture for the idea of a woman doing industrial work in support of the war. Note that there was no face yet, no image, no poster, just a name, a concept, and a cheerful melody about a woman with a riveting gun. Rosie was an abstraction in the summer of 1942. She was something the culture had named before it had quite figured out what she looked like. What happened next was that the abstraction acquired a face. But the face it acquired was not the face you are probably thinking of right now. The face it acquired first was painted by one of the most skilled illustrators in the history of American popular culture, a man whose work you almost certainly recognize even if you have never thought about it in the context of wartime propaganda. Norman Rockwell. You know Norman Rockwell, even if you think you do not. He painted the Four Freedoms during the war, a series of images that were reproduced on war bond posters and distributed across the country in numbers that stagger the imagination. Freedom of speech showed a man standing at a town meeting, his workman's jacket still on, his neighbors listening. Freedom from want showed a family gathered around a Thanksgiving table, a grandmother carrying the turkey, the whole scene radiating a warmth that felt both specific and universal. He painted the barbershop and the swimming hole and the doctor's office and the town meeting. He painted an idealized version of American life, so persistently and with such enormous skill that his paintings gradually became the idealized version of American life rather than just a representation of it. The territory and the map had quietly traded places. In May of 1943, Norman Rockwell painted Rosie the Riveter for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. This is, historically speaking, the original Rosie, the one that people in 1943 called by that name, the one that appeared on the cover of a magazine with a circulation of several million copies, and sat in waiting rooms and barbershops and living rooms across the country for as long as magazines were kept before they were thrown away. This is the Rosie that 1943 Americans actually knew, and she looks almost nothing like the Rosie you are thinking of. Rockwell's Rosie is a large, physically powerful woman. She occupies most of the frame, seated in a three-quarter pose that makes her seem to take up the entire space. She is eating a sandwich, which is a surprisingly humanizing detail for what is essentially a patriotic image. Her riveting gun rests across her lap with the casual authority of a scepter being rested rather than carried. Her forearms, which are visible because her sleeves are rolled up, are muscular in a way that leaves no ambiguity about whether she is physically capable of the work she does. She wears work clothes and has safety goggles pushed up onto her head. Behind her is a suggestion of light that functions as a halo, not subtly, but with the deliberate symbolism of an illustrator who knows exactly what he is doing. Beneath her feet, slightly crumpled, is a copy of Hitler's manifesto. She was modeled deliberately on the figure of the prophet Isaiah from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. If you put Rockwell's painting and the Sistine details side by side, the posture is unmistakable. Rockwell took the Renaissance gesture of prophetic authority and placed on an American factory worker eating lunch, and the result is simultaneously triumphal and domestic. A prophet eating a ham sandwich. A saint in steel-toed boots. Her lunchbox, sitting just below her, has a name sticker on it. Rosie. This is how we know, from within the painting itself, exactly who she is supposed to be. The Saturday Evening Post Rosie was seen by millions of Americans. She was a Rosie of the war years. And then, with the end of the war and the passage of time, she faded from the cultural consciousness, while something else, something that had been quietly filed away in a corporate archive since early 1943, gradually moved to take her place. Now we need to talk about the other poster. The one you are actually thinking of. The one with the blue work shirt and the polka dot bandana and the flexed arm and the direct expression. That is not quite a smile and not quite a challenge, but contains elements of both. In the early weeks of 1943, a commercial artist named J. Howard Miller was working on assignment for the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. The War Production Coordinating Committee had asked Westinghouse to produce a series of motivational posters for display in its plants. These were internal workplace posters. They were not government propaganda in any official sense. They were not designed for national distribution or for public display. They were, in the most literal and limited sense, posters made for factory workers at one company's facilities. Miller was given specifications and a brief. He produced a series of approximately 42 posters in total, each one designed to encourage workers in some aspect of their wartime production role. Safety, productivity, unity. One of them, produced in January of 1943, showed a woman in a blue work shirt with a polka dot bandana tied over her hair. Her right arm is raised and bent at the elbow to show a flexed bicep. She looks directly at the viewer with an expression that has, in the decades since it became famous, been described variously as confident, challenging, resolute, and determined. At the top of the poster, in bold letters on a yellow banner, are 4 words. We can do it. That is the poster. That is the one that is now known everywhere. And here is what almost nobody who knows the image knows about it. The poster was displayed in Westinghouse facilities for approximately 2 weeks in February of 1943. 2 weeks. Then it was replaced by another poster in the series. And it was not seen again by any significant audience for nearly 4 decades. It was not called Rosie the Riveter when it was made. Miller's poster had no title. There was no name attached to woman. There was no reference to riveting or to the Rosie that existed in the popular culture from the song. It was one workplace motivation poster among dozens, made for a specific internal audience at a single company, and it served that specific purpose for 2 weeks before it was quietly retired and filed away. For roughly 40 years, it sat in archives. And then something happened in the early 1980s that transformed not only how that particular image was understood, but how the entire history of women's wartime work was remembered and what meaning it carried in the culture. We will get to that. But first, we need to spend more time in the factories, because the myth of Rosie the Riveter is not only about posters and images and songs. It is about millions of real women who did real work under real conditions. And those conditions deserve careful, unhurried attention. You step off the bus at 5:45 in the morning. The air is cold in a way that gets inside your coat before you have finished buttoning it. The particular cold of very early morning in late autumn when the temperature has had all night to settle and the sun has not yet begun to push back. The factory ahead of you is enormous. A building whose roof seems to merge with the darkness above it, whose presence you sense more than see in those first moments. A thin flag of smoke rises from the chimney and drifts sideways. You join the stream of workers moving toward the entrance. 100 people, then 200, then more, converging from different buses and different streets. The crowd is a mix of men and women now. More women than there were 6 months ago, though men still outnumber them at most stations. Everyone moves with a particular quality of very early morning motion. Not slow exactly, but interior, as though each person is still assembling themselves for the day. You punch your time card. The clock stamps the time with a satisfying thud. You find your locker and change from your street clothes into your work clothes, which smell faintly of yesterday, even though you wash them. Some smells do not fully leave. You walk to your station. The noise comes up gradually as you move deeper into the building. Starting as a low vibration you feel more than hear, and rising to the full industrial volume of a working factory by the time you reach your position on the line. This is one of the things that newcomers are never quite prepared for, even after being warned. The noise is not background noise. It is not a condition you simply habituate to and stop noticing. The way you stop noticing the sound of traffic from a street below an apartment. It is a noise that has presence and mass, that touches your body rather than merely entering your ears. After months of working here, you have learned to have entire conversations at full volume that the person 3 feet away cannot hear. You have learned to read lips and to use hand signals and to save complicated things to say for the lunch break when the machines have been shut down and the ringing in your ears has settled to something manageable. You pick up your tools. You begin. The work itself, if your station involves riveting, requires a partner. This is one of the details that almost never makes it into the popular imagery of wartime factory work, which tend to show a lone, triumphant woman with a pneumatic gun. In practice, riveting is fundamentally a two-person operation. You need one worker on each side of the metal panel being joined. One person, the riveter, drives the rivet in with a pneumatic gun. The other person, called a bucker, holds a tool called a bucking bar against the opposite side of the rivet, providing resistance so that the rivet deforms properly and creates a secure seal. Without the bucker, the riveter cannot do the work. The work is inherently collaborative. You and your partner develop, over time, a kind of wordless understanding. You learn each other's rhythms, the particular speed at which each person works, the signals that mean slow down or hold steady or something is wrong here. You feel through the vibration of the bucking bar. When a rivet has seated correctly, you develop a precision that is entirely physical, entirely tactile, entirely unspeakable, because there are no words for it in any volume below a shout. On a good day, a good team can rivet several hundred rivets per shift. Rosie the Riveter and her partner, working at the Grumman aircraft plant in Bethpage, New York, set a production record of 433 rivets in a single shift. This was reported in the newspapers. It was a genuine achievement, the result of sustained speed and precision over 8 hours, and it was recognized as such. But a good day is a day when everything goes right, when the material is correct and equipment is functioning and your partner is at their best, and the supervisor is not changing production requirements in the middle of the shift, and the heat is not yet overwhelming, and your arms are not yet aching from the afternoon of the previous day. Not every day is a good day. The heat in summer was one of the factory's most reliable features. Industrial machinery generates heat continuously, the simple thermodynamic result of converting energy into motion. Forges and furnaces generate more. A factory building full of hundreds of workers, each producing body heat along with their industrial output, generates considerably more again. Before air conditioning became standard in industrial settings, a summer afternoon in a large manufacturing plant could reach temperatures that would today require mandatory rest breaks and hydration protocols and careful monitoring for heat-related illness. In 1943, the monitoring was less systematic. Workers fainted, sometimes when the heat was at its worst. A fainting worker was briefly a management problem, assessed and rested and returned to line, or sent home depending on severity. But the deeper issue, the fact that the conditions were producing workers who were at the edge of what bodies could sustain, was not typically addressed at the policy level. The policy was production. The policy was quota. The human body was a variable to be managed within those parameters. Women who raised concerns about heat conditions were not always received with sympathy. There was a persistent cultural assumption, not openly stated but structurally embedded in the workplace, that women who complained about factory conditions were proving the doubters right. You wanted this job. You said you could do this work. These are the conditions. Adjust accordingly. The chemical exposure was another category of hazard that the propaganda posters did not address. Many manufacturing processes require solvents and cleaning agents and coating materials that, when they off-gas into an enclosed space, produce fumes with a range of effects on human health. Headaches, dizziness, nausea, skin irritation from contact, long-term respiratory effects from extended exposure. The specific chemistry varied by factory and by process, and the hazard information available to workers varied even more. Sometimes workers were warned in general terms. More often, they learned by experience, by noticing that working near a particular process gave you a headache that lasted until dinner, or that a specific area of the factory made your eyes water after 20 minutes. The phrase occupational health and safety, in 1943, described an emerging field rather than an established practice. Workers largely relied on each other for hazard information, on the accumulated knowledge passed from experienced workers to new ones. You learn which areas of the factory required extra attention. You learned the informal rules that the formal rules did not cover. You learned that the person who had been here longest was not always the supervisor, but was always worth consulting. Accidents occur with the regularity that accidents occur when machines are large and sharp and fast, and the people operating them are sometimes tired. A riveting gun operated at the wrong angle can cause injury. Metal edges are unforgiving. Conveyor belts do not stop for fingers that should not be there. The pace of production in a wartime factory was relentless, and relentless environments with heavy machinery produced their inevitable arithmetic. Workers who were injured had options that were limited in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a later vantage point. Workers' compensation existed but was inconsistently applied and frequently contested. Women workers who raised concerns about safety conditions sometimes found their hours quietly reduced or their contracts not renewed. There was an implied bargain in the hiring of women for wartime work, and one of its less discussed clauses was that gratitude was expected and complaint was unwelcome. The women who worked in these conditions were not, on the whole, fragile. They were not the type to be defeated by discomfort. Many of them had come from backgrounds that included physical labor of various kinds, domestic work, agricultural work, previous factory jobs of a different kind. They were practical, and they were tough in the way that people who have always had to be practical become tough, not performatively, but structurally. But being tough does not mean you do not notice. They noticed everything. They noticed the heat and the noise and the fumes and the pace and the wages and the gap between the wages and the wages of the men beside them doing the same work. They noticed all of it. They simply had, in most cases, nowhere to put the noticing except into the body of accumulated private knowledge that they carried home at the end of each shift. Let's talk about money now, because money is always the clearest indicator of what a society actually values rather than what it claims to value. Women working in wartime factories were paid less than men doing the same work. Not a little less. Not a technically equivalent amount subjected to minor variations. Significantly, structurally, persistently less. The exact differential varied by industry, by facility, by job classification, and by all the creative ways that factory management found to classify women's work as technically different from men's work even when the work was functionally identical. Some plants address the problem by simply reclassifying the job itself. If a woman was now performing a task that a man had previously performed at a certain rate, the plant might redesignate that task as a woman's position with a woman's rate. The job had not changed. The work had not changed. Only the classification had changed, and with it, the wages. The War Labor Board, which oversaw labor disputes and wage questions during the war, established the principle of equal pay for equal work in 1942. The principle was stated clearly. Its enforcement was another matter. Factories contested the classifications. They argued that their women's rates and their men's rates applied to technically different positions, and thus the equal pay provision did not apply. The Fair Employment Practice Committee, which had jurisdiction over discriminatory practices in defense industries, was chronically underfunded and understaffed and processed complaints at a pace that must have been deeply discouraging to the people filing them. In practice, the equal pay policy existed primarily on paper throughout the war. Women who were doing the same work as men, standing at the same stations performing the same operations, continued to be paid at women's rates that fell below men's rates, sometimes by modest amounts and sometimes by amounts that were not modest at all. Union membership was a complicated territory for wartime women workers, and the complications illuminated something important about the labor movement's actual priorities in this period. Some unions admitted women enthusiastically and fought for their wage rights and treated them as full members with full representation. Some unions admitted women formally while steering them into separate, less powerful locals where their voice in collective bargaining was reduced. Some admitted women explicitly as temporary members, with language in the membership documents that made clear their standing would end when the war ended and the men came back. The institutional labor movement's relationship with women workers in the 1940s is not a particularly flattering chapter in labor history. This is worth noting primarily because it complicates the celebratory narrative of Rosie in a specific way. The culture, in its propaganda, celebrated women's wartime work. The institutions that theoretically protected workers' interests were often less enthusiastic about protecting the interests of this particular category of worker. Now let us talk about the women who have been most thoroughly and persistently left out of the Rosie story. Because the erasure of this particular group of women from the popular mythology is not an oversight. It is structural. The woman in the poster, whichever version of Rosie comes to mind, is white. This is not a neutral fact. It is a historically significant one because black women workers were a substantial part of the wartime industrial workforce, and their experience of that workforce was profoundly different from the experience of white women workers. And that difference is almost entirely invisible in the popular account of Rosie the Riveter. Before the war, black women in industrial employment were rare, and their rarity was not an accident of circumstance or preference. Explicit, legally condoned racial discrimination locked them out of factory work with a thoroughness that required active maintenance. Black women worked as domestic servants. They worked in agriculture. They worked in laundries and in the kinds of service and food preparation jobs that the economy assigned to people it did not extend at higher wage opportunities to. The industrial economy, with its real wages and its union protections and its implied promise of advancement over time, was a territory that had been carved out and labeled with invisible but effective signs that said not for you. The Second World War changed this, but it changed it in a manner that requires careful description because it was not degenerate. Inclusive change mythology implies. Black women were hired into wartime factories. Yes, but they were hired last, long after white women had already moved into the positions that offered the best wages and the most reasonable working conditions and the most possibility of learning skills that might transfer to post-war employment. By the time black women were being hired in significant numbers, the more desirable positions were filled. They were assigned to the stations that other workers had not wanted, the jobs in areas with the worst ventilation, the work that involved the most hazardous chemicals, the positions that required the most physical labor for the least reward. And then there was the treatment from co-workers and supervisors. There were, throughout the war years, incidents of white women workers refusing to work alongside black women. Not isolated incidents. Documented, reported, widespread incidents. There were spontaneous work stoppages, what the labor historians call wildcat strikes, initiated by white workers protesting the integration of factory floors. There was verbal harassment. There was a kind of low-grade, constant hostility that does not make newspaper headlines, but absolutely defines every hour of a person's daily experience. The looks and the comments and the deliberate small exclusions and the way a space can be made to feel occupied by hostile forces, even when no single dramatic event is occurring. President Franklin Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 8802 in June of 1941, prohibiting discriminatory hiring practices in defense industries. This was a significant moment in American civil rights history, coming several years before the more celebrated legislative achievements of the 1960s. The Fair Employment Practice Committee was created to investigate and address violations of the order. The committee investigated. It documented. It found violations in abundance. Its enforcement was thin. The distance between the stated policy and the experienced reality was not a gap. It was a canyon. And the women on the wrong side of that canyon knew it in their bodies, in their bank accounts, in the way they were spoken to or not spoken to, in the jobs they were assigned and the jobs they were not considered for. Rose Lee Logan worked in a munitions plant in Memphis, Tennessee. Ada Randolph worked in a shipyard in Baltimore. Etta Moten Barnett advocated publicly for black women workers, while also maintaining a career as an entertainer that provided her with a public platform most working women did not have. These women and millions like them did the work. They breathed the fumes and bore the heat and took the wages that were less than equal and went home and came back the next day and did it again. Their names are not on the poster. Their faces are not in the popular imagery of the era. The cultural story that was constructed around women's wartime work, both in the 1940s and in the feminist revision of the 1980s, centered whiteness as its default. This was not an accident. It was a choice made repeatedly and without much apparent discomfort by the people constructing the story. If we're going to talk seriously about the women who built the arsenal of democracy, we have to talk about all of them, including the ones the mythology most consistently leaves out. There is something that should be said about the daily logistics of being a working woman in the war years, because the logistics were genuinely formidable, and they were largely invisible in the propaganda that was supposed to be celebrating this work. The bus or the streetcar or the bicycle or the lift from a neighbor who also worked at the plant. These were the infrastructure of women's wartime employment, and they were rarely sufficient. Factory shifts often started and ended at hours that did not align well with public transit schedules. Factories located in newly expanded industrial zones, areas that had been built out rapidly to accommodate wartime manufacturing, were sometimes not well served by existing transportation at all. Women who lived far from their plants and had no private transportation solved this problem through arrangements that required coordination and flexibility that the factory schedule did not always accommodate. Childcare was, by some measures, the most significant logistical challenge of all. The Lanham Act of 1942 authorized federal funding for childcare facilities near defense production plants. This was a genuine policy achievement. The recognition at the federal level that mothers could not participate in the wartime workforce if there was nowhere to leave their children during work hours. Some excellent facilities were built, and the child care centers operated by the Kaiser Shipyard in Portland, Oregon have become something of a legend in the history of American early childhood care, offering extended hours, nutritious meals, and even a take-home dinner service for mothers who would otherwise have to cook after a long shift. But the Lanham Act facilities were not everywhere. They were not adequate to the need. They served some of the women who needed them, in some locations, some of the time. The majority of working mothers during the war years were held together by arrangements that were informal and precarious and required constant management. The neighbor's daughter who babysat after school, the grandmother who moved in for the duration, the two sisters whose shifts at different factories were carefully timed so that one of them was always home with the children. The image of Rosie the Riveter does not include the neighbor's daughter. It does not include the grandmother or the complicated scheduling negotiation or the phone call to your mother-in-law asking if she can please come a week earlier because your shifts have changed again. The real infrastructure that made women's wartime work possible was, in large part, other women providing the caregiving labor that freed the factory worker to do the factory work. This infrastructure was uncompensated. It was largely unacknowledged. It was treated as a natural and expected feature of the domestic landscape, rather than as a form of contribution to the war effort in its own right. As with so many things in this story, the invisible work was doing much of the actual work. You come home from your shift and the house smells different than it did before you started working, or maybe that is just something you notice now that you're coming home from somewhere else. You eat whatever is available. The rationing system means that some things are plentiful and some things are inexplicably scarce. And the geography of what you can get varies by week and by the particular store you visit, and by factors that nobody has fully explained, but that everyone has accepted as part of the general texture of wartime life. You eat standing up sometimes, because sitting feels like a decision that requires more energy than you currently have. You wash the oil from your hands. It does not come out completely in one washing. It has found its way into the creases at the base of your fingers, into the space beneath the nails, into the texture of your palms in a way that soap and water address but do not resolve. You wash again. You dry your hands on a towel that absorbs a day and holds it. The question of what you wear to work deserves more attention than it usually gets in the popular account, because clothing in the 1940s was not a simple matter, and the question of appropriate dress for factory work turned out to be more complicated than it might appear from the outside. The safety requirements were clear. Loose clothing was dangerous around machinery. Long hair was dangerous around machinery. Open-toed shoes were dangerous around machinery. These requirements were not negotiable, and they pointed toward a category of dress that women had not, historically, worn in large numbers. Women's industrial workwear as a distinct category, a garment industry specifically designed for women doing factory jobs, did not fully exist when the war began, because women had not been doing factory jobs in sufficient numbers to create demand for such a category. The clothing that women wore to factory work in the early war years was improvised and adapted. Men's work pants, taken in or otherwise altered to fit differently shaped bodies. Coveralls and jumpsuits that had been designed for men and wore differently on women. Ordinary women's clothing adapted with safety in mind. Sleeves rolled and pinned. Skirts replaced with slacks or trousers. And then there was the cultural pressure around femininity, which the war had not actually suspended so much as relocated. The propaganda messaging about women war workers went to remarkable lengths to reassure the audience that these women remained attractive, remained feminine, remained the women they had always been despite the oil and the work clothes and the early morning shifts. Magazine articles about women factory workers included photographs of them in clean clothes and fresh makeup after their shifts. Recruitment films emphasized that the work would not change who the women fundamentally were. The message was consistent and slightly anxious. You can do this work and still be a woman. The fact that this assurance was considered necessary tells you something about how fragile the cultural concept of womanhood was understood to be. The bandana, the red and white polka dot bandana of the poster, was a practical solution to the hair and machinery problem. It was also, in the poster's rendering of it, somewhat elegant, neatly tied, cheerful pattern, a garment that solved a real safety problem, while managing to look as though solving safety problems was something you could do with personal style. Real factory bandanas were whatever you had. They were practical before they were charming. They kept your hair back and absorbed sweat, and were washed and reused until they were indistinguishable from rags. In the poster, of course, the bandana is iconic. In the factory, it was laundry. The women who took factory jobs during the war years came from such different backgrounds that any attempt to describe them as a single type immediately runs into the friction of the actual variety. Some were young, in their late teens or early 20s, women who had expected to move from their parents' house to their husband's house without any significant interval of financial independence in between. These women found in the wartime factory something that surprised them by how much they valued it. Money they had earned themselves, deposited into an account that bore their name, available for decisions they made without consulting anyone else. The surprise pleasure of this discovery lasted, for many of them, well beyond the duration of the war. Some were older, in their 30s or 40s, women whose husbands were overseas and who needed income not as a revelation but as a practical necessity. The government allotment for military wives was calculated on a formula that prioritized the war effort over the comfort of the families left behind. And many of these women found that the gap between the allotment and actual household expenses was not a gap that patriotism alone could bridge. Some had been working before the war in retail or clerical positions or the kinds of jobs that were coded as acceptable for women and paid accordingly. They took factory jobs because the wages were better. In some cases, significantly better. The experience of earning a real wage, a wage that reflected the difficulty and importance of the work rather than the gender of the person doing it, was for many of these women a radically new experience, even if they had been employed before. Some came from rural backgrounds, women who had spent their lives doing physical labor of the agricultural kind, who arrived in the industrial cities with practical knowledge of how to work hard with their bodies that made the factory feel manageable in ways it did not to women who had spent their lives in more sedentary settings. And some came to factory work from domestic service, the category of employment that had absorbed the largest proportion of working women before the war, and that had the most oppressive set of conditions. Low wages, no fixed hours, no privacy, social invisibility, and a power dynamic between employer and employee that had not changed fundamentally since domestic service was a euphemism for near servitude. The factory, with its fixed shifts and its collective setting and its wage that was paid to you rather than handed to you at someone's discretion, was, for women coming from domestic service, a genuine improvement even in its worst aspects. They were not a monolith. They did not all want the same things from the work. They did not all have the same experience of it. They brought different histories and different needs and different capacities for tolerating various kinds of difficulty. And the propaganda that presented them as a single cheerful image, the Rosie type, was doing exactly what propaganda does, smoothing the complicated into the simple, collapsing many real people into one symbolic person. The symbolic person can do work that real people, with their variety and their complications, cannot do. But the symbolic person also cannot fully represent the real people, and the gap between representation and reality is where the important things tend to happen. Now the poster again. The J. Howard Miller poster. We need to go back to it, because we have not yet fully addressed the question that became, in the early 21st century, a genuine historical controversy. Who was the woman in the poster? For decades, this question seemed either unanswerable or unimportant. The image was an icon, and icons function independent of the specific identities of the people who constitute them. The Statue of Liberty is not a particular woman. Uncle Sam is not a particular man. The power of symbolic imagery comes from its abstraction, from the fact that it can hold the projection of many people's meanings without belonging definitively to any individual story. But as the Miller poster became increasingly famous in its second life, and as a feminist and cultural significance being assigned to it grew, the question of who the woman actually was began to carry weight. If the image represented women's wartime strength, it would be meaningful to know whose strength, specifically, had been the model for it. The question started receiving public attention in the 1990s, when a Michigan woman named Geraldine Doyle was identified as a possible model. A 1942 photograph taken at the American Brooch and Machine Company in Ann Arbor, Michigan showed a young woman in a pose and clothing that bore resemblance to the poster figure. Doyle was identified as the woman in the photograph. The identification was reported in newspapers and magazines and repeated in books and documentary films. Doyle herself, a gracious and thoughtful woman, accepted the identification. She became, for a number of years, the official face behind the most famous face in American feminist imagery. She was charming in interviews. She was pleased that her contribution had been recognized. She seemed genuinely moved by the significance others assigned to the image. And then a scholar named James Kimball, working with meticulous care through archives and primary sources, found something that changed the identification entirely. Kimball examined the original photograph that had been used to identify Doyle and concluded, through careful comparison of visual evidence and contextual research, that the photograph was not taken in Ann Arbor. It was taken at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, California, and the woman in the photograph was not Geraldine Doyle. It was a 20-year-old worker named Naomi Parker. Naomi Parker was born in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her family moved to California during her childhood. In the spring of 1942, she was working at the Naval Air Station in Alameda, one of several women who had taken positions in a facility that was rapidly expanding to meet wartime demand. A United Press International photographer documented the workers at the station, and one of the resulting photographs showed Naomi Parker at her workstation, wearing a polka-dot bandana tied in a manner that would look, to anyone who saw the Miller poster years later, immediately familiar. The photograph was published in newspapers in the spring of 1942. It circulated. It was seen. And Miller, a commercial artist who worked with photographic references in the way that graphic designers of the era routinely did, may well have had access to it and used it as one of his reference points for the poster. Kimball published his research in the academic journal Rhetoric and Public Affairs in 2016. The identification was taken seriously by scholars and by journalists. The story reached Naomi Parker Fraley, who by then was in her mid-90s, living in Longview, Washington. She had married twice, and by the time the identification found her, she was Naomi Parker Fraley, using her second husband's surname. She had spent decades not knowing that she might be the face behind one of the most reproduced images in American history. She had seen the poster over the years, as it became famous, and had privately thought that the woman in it looked rather like the woman in the photograph from the Naval Air Station. But this was the kind of thought that seemed too large and too improbable to pursue. When the identification reached her formally, when Kimball's research was communicated to her and the media began to pay attention, she was moved and she was frustrated, and she was, at 95 years old, very clear about wanting the story to be accurate. She died in January of 2018 at the age of 96. The identification is strong, but not universally considered definitive in every detail. These scholarly debates have their own conventions and their own standards of evidence, and the visual evidence, while compelling, leaves some room for the careful hedging that responsible scholarship requires. But the weight of the current evidence points toward Naomi Parker Fraley as a woman whose image may have become, through several degrees of artistic mediation, the most recognized female face in American popular culture. That face spent most of its life invisible to the history that had, in some sense, taken the image without acknowledgement and built an icon from it. Geraldine Doyle, for her part, died in December 2010, before the identification was revised. She was 67 years old and had lived a full life in Michigan, working as a cellist and raising a family, and, in her final decades, graciously fulfilling the role that history had assigned to her. That the assignment turned out to be based on mistaken identification is not a reflection on her character. She was as surprised as anyone when the photographs surfaced in the 90s, and as moved as anyone by what the image meant to people. History has its awkward moments, and the displacement of one mistakenly identified woman by a more correctly identified woman is, in the scope of the full story's complications, one of the more human ones. Now we need to talk about the final chapter of the wartime story, because it is a chapter that the Rosie mythology handles most inadequately, and it is a chapter that matters most for understanding what actually happened to the women who did this work. It is September of 1945. The war in Europe ended in May. After years of grinding, enormously costly combat that eventually pressed Germany from multiple directions until there was nowhere left to press toward. The war in the Pacific ended in August after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, events that remain among the most morally complex in modern history, and that are, for our purposes tonight, mentioned primarily because they marked the end of the conflict that had reorganized American social life for 4 years. The men are coming home. This is a genuinely joyful thing in many respects, and it would be wrong to flatten it into something else in order to make a point about what happened simultaneously. Men who had been away for years were returning to families who had missed them intensely. Women who had been managing households and raising children alone were reuniting with husbands and brothers and sons. The joy was real. The relief was real. And then, with remarkable speed and with what appears in retrospect to have been considerable advanced planning, the process reversed. The layoffs of women workers began within weeks of the Japanese surrender. Some factories laid off women before the men they were theoretically replacing had actually returned to the region. The process was not dramatic. It was bureaucratic. It happened through the normal mechanisms of employment. Reduced hours, non-renewal of contracts, the quiet elimination of positions that were then declared filled when the veteran came back to reclaim them. The legal structure supported this process with unusual efficiency. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known to history as the GI Bill and celebrated, with considerable justification, as one of the most transformative pieces of social legislation in American history, included provisions guaranteeing returning veterans the right to their previous positions. If you had held a job when you enlisted or were drafted, the employer was required to give it back to you when you came home. This was a meaningful protection for the men who needed it. For the women who had held those jobs in the interim, it was the legal formalization of their temporariness. Union contracts, where they existed and where women had been admitted to membership, often included similar provisions for veterans. And the unions that had been ambivalent about women's membership during the war became considerably more definite about their position at the end of it. Women who had been paying dues for years found themselves outside the protection those dues were supposed to purchase. The speed of the reversal was, to the women experiencing it, notable. The factories had told them they were temporary when they hired them. The factories now demonstrated that the temporariness had arrived, right on the schedule that had always been implicit in the arrangement. From the factory's perspective, everything was proceeding as expected. The women had been hired for the duration. The duration was over. But the culture did not frame the mass layoff of 6 million women as a mass layoff. It framed it as a homecoming. The men were back. The women could rest at last from the burden of the emergency they had stepped up to meet. The word used was often not fired but freed. The women were being freed from the necessity that had temporarily imposed an unusual life on them and returned to their natural state, which was domestic, which was supportive, which was oriented toward the family rather than the factory. Surveys taken in the weeks and months following the end of the war showed that the women being freed in this manner did not uniformly experience the process as liberation. Significant majorities of women who have been working in industrial jobs reported in these surveys that they wished to continue working, not necessarily at the same factory or doing the same work, but in general, in the sense of being employed and earning wages and doing something outside the household that was recognized and compensated. The experience of wartime work had changed something in them. They had been competent. They had been useful in ways the culture had noticed and named and rewarded, financially if not equally. They had been people with jobs, and jobs had turned out to mean something to them that they had not quite anticipated. The culture was not particularly interested in these survey results. The culture was interested in reconstruction, in the rebuilding of the family unit, in the suburban dream that was beginning to take shape in the architectural imagination of post-war America, the house with a lawn, and the car in the driveway, and the children in the yard, and the wife in the kitchen, and the husband coming home from a job that was definitively his, not hers, not borrowed, not temporary. The women went home, most of them, because the jobs were gone and the culture's expectation was clear and the mechanisms for resisting that expectation were not well developed. Some of them cried on the bus. Some of them told themselves it was fine. Some of them felt something that they did not have language for yet, something that would find its language a generation later, when their daughters and granddaughters began to articulate it. The 1950s arrived and brought with them a particular cultural mood that has been subsequently understood in various ways, as either a golden age or a golden cage, or both simultaneously, depending on whose experience of the decade you're reading. The popular mythology of the 1950s woman is by now almost as familiar as the Rosie mythology. The perfect housewife, cheerfully domestic, baking and cleaning and raising children in a suburban house that was always clean and always warm and always organized around the comfort of a husband who came home from work tired and deserving. The June Cleaver model, the model that the first wave of second wave feminists identified as the cage they were escaping. The actual 1950s were more complicated. Women's labor force participation in the 1950s was actually higher than it had been in the pre-war period. Women were working. They were working in clerical positions and in nursing and in teaching and in retail and in the service sector jobs that had always been considered appropriate for women. They were working in lower wage, lower status positions than they had held during the war. But they were working, and their numbers in the paid workforce grew through the decade rather than declining. What the 1950s really represented, in the context of the Rosie story, was a strategic cultural forgetting. The wartime factory work was not celebrated in the post-war years. It was not incorporated into a story about women's capabilities, or their economic contributions, or their place in the workforce. It was filed away as an emergency measure, as something that had happened because of extraordinary circumstances, and that was now over because the extraordinary circumstances were over. The women who had done it were thanked, implicitly and briefly, and then asked to move along. There were no monuments to Rosie in the 1950s. There were no museum exhibitions, no documentary films, no serious journalism investigating what had happened to the millions of women who had built the war effort and then been sent home from it. The word riveter appeared in the culture in its literal sense only. As a symbol, it had been retired along with the factories that had given it meaning. The women themselves largely did not talk about it. The culture had not asked them to. They had been told that what they had done was temporary and unremarkable, a response to an emergency rather than an expression of capability, and many of them, in the habit of believing what the larger culture tells them about the significance of their own experiences, accepted this framing. They raised children and kept houses, and some of them worked and some of them did not. And the years went by, and the story of what they had done during the war settled into the category of things that happened but are not particularly important. The Miller poster sat in the Library of Congress archive. The Rockwell Rosie was reproduced occasionally in retrospective pieces about the war, but even there she was not primarily understood as a statement about women's capabilities. She was understood as a charming period piece, an artifact of a specific moment, interesting as illustration but not as argument. Rosie the Riveter as a cultural force essentially disappeared between approximately 1945 and the early 1980s. And then the world changed, as the world sometimes does, and it changed in ways that made something sitting in an archive suddenly and urgently relevant. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s reshaped American culture in ways that are still being fully reckoned with. The movement addressed employment discrimination, reproductive rights, domestic violence, educational access, and the full range of conditions that constituted women's lives in mid-century America. It produced legislation. It produced organizations. It produced a literature and a scholarly apparatus that began, among other things, to look back at history and find the women who had been rendered invisible by previous accounts. It was in this context, in the early 1980s, that someone went looking to the Library of Congress archives and found the Miller poster. The circumstances of the rediscovery are not entirely clear in the historical record. As these things often are, what is clear is that once the image circulated, it spread. It appeared in feminist publications. It was reprinted and reproduced. It traveled from archives to walls, from walls to dorm rooms, from dorm rooms to office doors and refrigerator fronts, and the public spaces where people put things that mean something to them. the image in its second life, was immediately understood as a statement about women's strength and capability and right to equal participation in economic and public life. This understanding was not derived from the image's original context, because almost nobody knew its original context. Almost nobody knew that it was a Westinghouse employee motivation poster displayed for 2 weeks in 1943. Almost nobody knew that it was not titled, not called Rosie, not distributed nationally, not a government campaign. They knew how it made them feel, which was strong, which was capable, which was like perhaps the world's current arrangement was not the only possible arrangement. The feeling was genuine. The historical basis for it was largely fictional, in the sense that the story being told about the image was a story constructed in the 1980s and projected backward onto the 1940s. But the feeling it generated was real, and it did real work. Women who looked at the poster in the 1980s were not looking at a 2-week Westinghouse poster from 1943. They were looking at a symbol that the culture had assembled to carry a specific set of aspirations. And the symbol worked because it was an image of a woman who was competent and unafraid, and who said, in 4 words, that she could do the thing in front of her. That message was needed in the 1980s. That message is needed, arguably, whenever it circulates. The accuracy of its historical framing is a separate question from its usefulness as a symbol. But the academic world, which has an entirely healthy and appropriate relationship with the question of whether the historical framing of a widely circulated symbol is accurate, began paying close attention to the Rosie mythology in the 1990s and into the 21st century. Scholars of rhetoric, of history, of women's studies, of visual culture began tracing the specific provenance of the images and the names and the associations that had become tangled together under the single header of Rosie the Riveter. They separated the song from the Rockwell image from the Miller poster. They established the Miller poster's 2-week display period. They documented the differences between what the posters were actually intended to communicate and what the later culture had decided they meant. What they found was that the popular understanding of Rosie the Riveter was almost entirely a 1980s construction. The image everyone recognized was not called Rosie in 1943. The image that was called Rosie in 1943 was a Rockwell painting that most people today would not identify as Rosie. The celebration of women's wartime work that the image supposedly represented had not existed in any organized way during the war itself. The women who had done the work had been thanked briefly and sent home efficiently. The symbol's triumphant meaning was a retroactive assignment made by a different generation with different needs, finding in the archives something that could carry the weight of a present aspiration. The retroactive assignment was not dishonest in any malicious sense. It was the way that cultures use history when they need it. They reach into the past and find something that resembles what they're looking for, and they bring it forward and they assign it meaning. The meaning is real because it does real work for real people. It is not false in the way that a lie is false. It is simply not the same as the original historical context, and confusing them is a specific kind of error that has specific consequences for understanding what actually happened. What actually happened is important. It is worth saying again, clearly, because clarity is what the story has been lacking. Millions of women entered the industrial workforce during the Second World War. They did genuinely difficult work under genuinely difficult conditions. They were paid less than the men beside them doing the same work. They were told clearly and repeatedly that their employment was temporary. They were given a recruitment message that was patriotic and effective, and also deeply limited in what it promised. They were, in large numbers, denied the equal wages and equal protections that the official policy claimed to guarantee. Women of color were treated as an afterthought and subjected to discrimination that compounded the discrimination all women workers faced. At the end of the war, they were laid off efficiently and quickly, and the culture reframed the layoffs as a restoration of the natural order. The women who wanted to continue working, which surveys suggested was a substantial majority, were not given a meaningful opportunity to make that argument to anyone who could act on it. The structures, both legal and social, had been built to ensure the temporariness of women's wartime employment. And those structures performed their function. The women went home and largely did not speak publicly about what they had experienced, because the culture did not invite that speech, and because what they had experienced was complicated in ways that did not fit neatly into either the triumphant wartime narrative or the domestic post-war narrative. They knew what they were capable of. They knew what they had been paid. They knew the gap between those two things. They held that knowledge privately, in the way that people hold things that the surrounding culture tells them are not quite worth saying out loud. Decades later, someone who needed a symbol found their image in an archive. The person who needed the symbol was not being dishonest. The need was real. The symbol served it. The gap between the symbol's historical meaning and the meaning being assigned to it was not examined very carefully in the moment of the symbol's revival, because the moment of revival was not primarily a moment for historical examination. It was a moment for inspiration, and inspiration has its own relationship with accuracy. But here is the interesting thing about what happens when the gap between a symbol and its history is eventually examined. The actual history is more interesting than the symbol. The actual history contains more human complexity, more moral difficulty, more genuine heroism in the face of worse odds than the symbol suggests. The women who worked in the factories were not doing it under a banner of feminist empowerment. Many of them had never heard of feminist empowerment, which would not have been a language available to them in 1943 in any case. They were doing it because the war needed doing and the bills needed paying, and they turned out to be capable, and they were told to go home at the end of it. The fact that they were told to go home, rather than welcomed as permanently capable workers who had demonstrated what they could do, is not a detail that diminishes the story. It is the story. It is a story of how social change actually moves, which is never in a straight line and never with the speed and enthusiasm that the retrospective symbols suggest. The change they made was real, even if it was not recognized. The women who worked in wartime factories changed their understanding of themselves. They changed the expectations of the daughters who watched them. They changed the evidence available to anyone who wanted to argue in the decade that followed that women could do industrial work, because the evidence was not theoretical anymore. It had happened. It had happened at enormous scale. It could not be made to have not happened, even if it could be minimized and forgotten and stored in archives for 40 years. The forgetting and the rediscovery are both part of the story. The symbol, in its many uses and appropriations across the decades since the 1980s, has become a kind of test case for how images travel through time and what happens to their meanings as they travel. Though we can do it, images appeared on t-shirts and tote bags and greeting cards and coffee mugs and refrigerator magnets, sold in museum gift shops around the world. It has been overlaid with different colors, different text, different faces. Women from various national and political contexts have substituted their own faces or their own causes for the original image, creating a visual dialogue with the poster that the poster's creator could not have imagined and the original audience at the Westinghouse plant definitely did not experience. The image has also, more uncomfortably from the perspective of the feminist activists who helped make it famous, been used in explicitly non-feminist and occasionally anti-feminist contexts. Conservative commentators have used it to celebrate women who choose domestic roles over professional ones, arguing that the poster's message of "we can do it" applies equally to the choice to stay home. It has been used to promote causes that have nothing to do with women's rights. It has been attached to commercial products that the women's movement would find baffling or offensive. This is the price of becoming an icon. An icon belongs to everyone who can use it, which eventually means everyone. The people who were most instrumental in building the icon's cultural power cannot ultimately control who else takes it up and what they do with it. The image has, in the language of intellectual property, become too famous to be proprietary. There is something both maddening and appropriate about this. The image was always, in some sense, not what it appeared to be. It was a too-weak internal poster masquerading, in its second life, as a feminist manifesto. The fact that it can then be further appropriated into other contexts, other meanings, other arguments, is perhaps consistent with the fundamental instability of its identity from the beginning. Icons are vessels. They hold whatever the culture pours into them. The pouring never quite stops. Let us come around, now, to the question of what we want from history and what we do to history in the wanting. This is a question that the Rosie story illuminates with unusual clarity. We want history to be legible. We want the past to contain people who faced difficulty and overcame it and were recognized for doing so, because this is a story we find most useful in the present. We want the arc to bend in the right direction. We want the recognition to come, if not immediately, then eventually, and to be proportionate to the achievement. The reality of historical experience almost never cooperates with these preferences. The achievement and the recognition are decoupled. The recognition arrives later, not at all, or arrives for the wrong reasons, or in the wrong form, or attached to the wrong image. The women who built the aircraft were not given the symbol. The symbol was given to a different woman entirely, and the connection to the actual workers was constructed retroactively, imperfectly, by people who needed a symbol more than they needed accuracy. And yet, the symbol did something. The feminist revival of the Rosie image in the 1980s contributed to a cultural conversation about women's capabilities and women's rights that was consequential in ways that pure historical accuracy might not have been. The image is simpler than the history. The image is available in a glance, where the history requires time and attention, and the kind of sustained focus that is hard to maintain when you're trying to win a political argument or inspire a movement. The image and the history are not the same thing. They serve different purposes. They belong to different conversations. The mistake is in conflating them, in treating the image as if it were the history, in telling the story of wartime women's work as though it had the shape that the poster gives it. The shape the poster gives it is clean and triumphant and resolved. The shape the history gives it is complicated and unresolved and ongoing. The women did the work. They were not adequately compensated. They were asked to leave. Some of them carried the experience into the rest of their lives in ways that shaped the lives of the people who came after them. The recognition that eventually came was belated and partial, and attached to an image they had never seen. The woman who may have been the face behind the face lived 96 years, and spent most of them invisible to the history that had claimed her image. That is the shape of the actual story. It is not a clean shape. It does not resolve into a single four-word declaration. It is more like what actual lives are like, which is complicated and intermittent and full of things that happened and were not acknowledged, and that nevertheless left marks on the world. The factories are quiet now. The war ended decades and decades ago. The factories that produced the bombers and the shells and the tank parts have been repurposed or demolished or preserved as industrial history museums where visitors walk through and try to imagine the noise. The presses are still. The conveyor belts do not move. The silence is thorough in a way that silence is thorough when it replaces something that was once very loud. The women who worked in those factories have mostly died. The youngest of them, the teenagers who started in 1942, would be in their late 90s today, and the years have taken most of them. A few remain, occasionally interviewed by historians or documentary filmmakers who are trying to reconstruct the texture of what it was actually like. They remember the noise first, when they are asked what they remember, then the smell, then the particular way of the tools after a long shift, the way your arms felt like they had borrowed the way of the factory and were slow to return it. They remember the women they worked beside, whose names they remember with a clarity that suggests those names were important to them and were kept carefully. Some of them remember a pride in the work that they are slightly shy about claiming now, perhaps because the culture later told them so insistently that the work was not theirs to claim, that it was temporary, that it was service rendered and then relinquished. The pride survived in private even when it was not publicly sanctioned, and in the interviews it emerges carefully, as something that has been kept well and has not diminished. Some of them know about the poster. Some of them know about the symbol that was built from their era and their labor and attached to an image they had never seen during the years when they were doing the work. Some of them find this amusing in the way that complicated things are sometimes amusing when enough time has passed. Some of them have opinions about the accuracy of the representation, not sharp opinions, but the quiet, settled opinions of people who have earned the right to them by having been actually present. They were there. They know the details that do not fit in the poster. They know about the oil under the fingernails that did not completely wash out. They know about the co-worker who lost 2 fingers in a press accident and came back to work 6 weeks later because there was no provision for extended medical leave and the rent still needed paying. They know about the supervisor who explained the wage differential with a confidence that suggested he had never once questioned whether it was just, had never needed to question it, had existed in a world where the justness of his position was assumed by the world around him and therefore required no examination. They know about the afternoon in August of 1945 when the shift ended and the supervisors called everyone together and made an announcement that was brief and businesslike and amounted to, "Thank you. We no longer need you. Here are the forms for your final paycheck." They know what the bus home felt like that day. Naomi Parker Fraley knew. She knew what it was to work a shift and what it was to go home from it, and what it was to be young in a time when the world was asking extraordinary things of ordinary people, and the ordinary people were providing them without ceremony. She knew what polka dot bandanas felt like wrapped around her hair, and what a naval air station smelled like in the California spring of 1942. She did not know, for most of her life, that a photograph of her at work had been used, possibly, as a reference for an image that would become one of the most recognized in American history. She did not know that the image would be filed for 40 years and then rediscovered and attached to a name that was not originally the image's name and to a meaning that was not originally the image's meaning. When she finally found out, in the final years of her life, she responded with a combination of emotion and clear-eyed realism that characterizes people who have lived long enough to have a perspective on the gap between stories and what actually happened. She was glad to be recognized. She wanted the history to be accurate. She had been there. She knew the details. She died in January of 2018 at the age of 96, which means she was born in the same year as the Bolshevik Revolution and died in the same year as the first mass-market electric car, and spent the years between those two events living a life that the culture had not, for most of its duration, considered particularly worth knowing about. She built things. She was sent home. She lived her life. Decades later, people put her face on tote bags, and she found this touching and slightly bewildering, which seems, on reflection, like the most accurate response available. What do we actually know when we set aside the myth and look carefully at the documented record? We know that approximately 6 million women entered the paid workforce between 1940 and 1945, a number that represents a significant expansion of women's industrial employment, even if it builds on a substantial pre-existing foundation of women in paid work. We know that women were concentrated during the war in manufacturing industries that had previously employed very few of them. Aircraft production, shipbuilding, ammunition and ordnance manufacturing, electrical equipment assembly. These were industries with real wages and, in some cases, union protections that most women's previous employment had not offered. We know that women's wages during the war were better in real terms than the wages most of them had previously earned, even accounting for persistent and largely unaddressed gap between men's and women's rates for equivalent work. We know that the government's recruitment campaign was explicitly and deliberately framed as temporary from its inception. Women were brought in to serve the duration of the emergency, and this temporariness was not hidden. It was the stated terms of the arrangement. We know that black women workers face a compounding of discriminatory barriers throughout the war, being hired last, assigned to the least desirable positions, subjected to hostile treatment from co-workers and supervisors, and receiving the least benefit from a nominal equal pay and fair employment policies that the government claimed to be enforcing. We know that the layoffs at the end of the war were fast and efficient and largely unchallenged in any organized way, because the legal structures and the union protections and the cultural expectations had all been aligned throughout the war to ensure that the arrangement was temporary. We know that surveys at the time showed substantial majorities of wartime women workers wishing to continue in employment, a fact that was acknowledged by researchers and largely ignored by policymakers. We know that the Miller poster was not publicly visible during the war, was not called Rosie the Riveter, and did not become famous until it was rediscovered in the early 1980s. We know that the Rockwell painting was a culturally prominent Rosie of the wartime period, seen by millions of Americans, recognized by the name, and then gradually eclipsed by an image it had never competed with because the competing image was in an archive. We know that the feminist movement adoption of the Miller poster in the 1980s created a meaning for it that was different from its original meaning, and that this new meaning has been enormously influential in shaping how the public understands women's wartime work. We know that the public understanding is, in several important ways, inaccurate. We know that the inaccuracy has not prevented the symbol from doing real and significant cultural work. And we know that the real history, told fully and carefully, is at least as interesting as a myth, and in some ways more so, because it contains people whose actual experiences were more complicated and more human, and more resistant to easy resolution than the 4 words on the poster allow. Let us close now. As the night settles in, and the factories have been quiet for a very long time, the woman in the poster will outlast all of us. She was made from a specific woman's face, possibly in a photograph taken in a California spring decades ago, and then redrawn by an artist working to a brief, and then filed away, and then found and then placed on tote bags and coffee mugs and the walls of classrooms and the banners of political rallies and the merchandise of 1,000 companies that recognize her remarkable quality of resolute capability. She will keep being placed on things. She will keep meaning whatever the culture needs her to mean in a given moment. She will be feminist and post-feminist and conservative and progressive and commercial and political and ironic and sincere, often nearly simultaneously. Because that is what happens to images that have become sufficiently powerful. They stop belonging to anyone specific. They become available. The real women. The ones who woke before sunrise and took the bus to the factory and picked up the tools and made the things and came home tired and came back the next day. Those women lived and worked and were overlooked and died, most of them, before the culture decided it was interested in them. The ones who lived long enough to be interviewed and acknowledged had a kind of wry composure about the belated recognition. That is one of the more moving things in this whole long story. They had been there. They knew what it was like. They had their own assessments of the gap between the symbol and the experience. And those assessments were usually gentler than the gap might seem to warrant. Perhaps because people who have actually lived through difficult things develop a tolerance for the way difficult things get simplified in the retelling. Hold 2 things at once, if you can. The symbol and the history. The inspiring image and the complicated reality. The woman in the poster, strong and capable and direct, and the millions of women behind her, equally strong and capable and direct, but also underpaid and overlooked and dismissed and eventually sent home. Both are real. The symbol is real because it does real work for real people. The history is real because it happened to real people. The gap between them is real because it was built deliberately by a culture that wanted to labor without the full implications of what the labor meant. The gap is also where the interesting things live. It is where the actual complexity of human experience in a time of crisis is preserved against the smoothing action of myth. It is where Naomi Parker Fraley wrapping her hair in a polka dot bandana on a California morning in 1942 is still a specific person doing a specific thing in a specific place, rather than a symbol on a tote bag. Both are worth holding. The symbol because it inspires. The history because it is true. The shift is over now. The machines wind down through the frequencies, from a high noise that lives in your skull to the lower hum that you feel more than hear, and finally to a silence that arrives gradually, the way silence arrives after something loud, filling in around the edges of the last sounds until it is complete. You peel off your work gloves. You feel the skin of your palms, slightly raw from the grip, faintly imprinted by the texture of the tool handle. The smell of the factory will stay with your clothes for a while. You have stopped being able to fully separate it from the smell of yourself. This, too, is what months of this work does. You and the place become mutually impregnated. You walk with the other workers through the changing area. The voices rise again now that the machines are quiet. People talking away at people who have been listening to machinery for hours instead of listening to each other. Slightly too fast. Slightly too loud. Glad to be using language again. Someone laughs. The laugh echoes in the concrete room, and someone else laughs at the echo, and for a moment the end of a hard shift is genuinely pleasant. You find your things. You put on your street clothes. You join the stream of workers heading for the exits and the buses, and whatever arrangement will take you back to the place where you sleep. The bus is crowded with people at the end of their shifts, and the windows fog with the breath of all those bodies. And the streets outside are whatever season it is, whatever time of day your particular shift has produced as its exit point into the world. You hold the overhead rail. The bus lurches and rights itself and moves forward. You think about dinner, or about your children, or about nothing in particular, which is a form of rest that the body finds on its own when the mind releases its grip on the work. Outside the window, the city moves past in its ordinary way. The shop fronts and the street corners and the people walking in both directions, each of them arriving from somewhere and heading somewhere else. You do not think of yourself as a symbol. You are a person on a bus after a long shift, with your hands still carrying the day's accumulated textures, with your arms that little bit heavy, with your mind beginning to slow drift toward evening. Somewhere in the company's files, there's a poster. It will sit there for a very long time. But tonight, you are just going home. Good night, wherever you are watching from. Thank you for spending this evening in the factories, in the heat and the noise, with the women who riveted the aircraft and welded the hulls and assembled the components that crossed the oceans during the Second World War. Their story is more complicated than the poster. It is more human than the icon. It is more worth knowing in all its difficulty and its dignity and its long, slow, imperfect journey towards something like recognition. If this episode gave you something to think about and maybe, just maybe, helped ease you into a little rest, we would be very grateful if you left a like and let the channel know you were here. Every like tells the mysterious workings of the algorithm that someone found this worth their time, and that helps more people find their way to these quiet, careful explorations of history. And please, in the comments, tell us where you are watching from. There is someone in a time zone you have never thought about who is hearing the same story right now. There is something quietly wonderful about that, about the way a single story can travel. The lights can go the rest of the way down now. The factory is behind you. Rest well.